Welcome back to Paris Lesbos. One of us is a pixie, the other gets called Rena. We're moving right along away from Paris for the start of this episode, but we do drift back later. You may have heard her name crop up in previous episodes alongside her ex-husband, or you know her in relation to the poet H.D. and for her own writings, perhaps her historical novels. It's Bryher.
So who is this Bryher? And how does she get that mononym? I assume that she's not born with it.
Starting from the top, Bryher is not born Bryher, as that is the name of an island off the coast of the UK. Instead, she's born Annie Winifred Ellerman, the type of name that conjures a granny in her rocking chair on the front porch instead.
You know, now that you say that, yeah.
Born in September 1894, she was the illegitimate and eldest child of a shipowner and financier who at one time was believed to be the richest man in England.
Who was her mother? Do we know?
So her mother was also English, but I don't get a very clear sense of her or her background. Just going through skimming again the beginning of Bryher's own memoirs. And then if you wanted to do the really quick way, dear listener, and look it up on Wikipedia, it also doesn't say anything beyond a name.
Love historical sexism. Excellent. No notes. So you said that they weren't married. Did this ever change, or?
Yes, her parents would marry later before her brother was born.
Got it. So they just hadn't gotten to it quite yet when she came around.
No, quite unconventional for late Victorian, early Edwardian period, from my understanding. Despite this lack of wedded parents and the mores around this time, Bryher had a good childhood, even with the frequent escapes to go exploring and having to be brought back by fishermen who'd find her by the shore.
That is so funny. We caught this weirdly shaped fish.
There were also trips abroad. One such trip to Paris. She may have crossed paths with the famous French writer Colette in a park, but a 5-year-old would not have been impressed. In fact, despite writing to her decades later and moving through almost the same circles, Bryher never officially met Colette.
Ooh, ships passing in the night.
During these travels, Bryher was taken along with a governess to accompany her parents. It rather reminds me of the adventures of young Indiana Jones, actually, right down to running around with local children in Egypt. Due to this upbringing, Bryher did not really have formal schooling until she was a teenager. Unlike several of our ladies on this podcast, she wasn't shunted off into a boarding school when her parents wanted to travel. She also got exposed to fencing, my own sport. In fact, she took up épée after going from her first ex-military instructor to a club in London, which I need to point out is unusual. If you've listened to the other episodes where fencing appeared, namely Olga de Meyer and Tupi Lowther, you will remember that women were not immediately included in épée fencing as it is the heaviest of the fencing blades and was deemed inappropriate for women. Many women stuck with foil, a lighter blade that used to be more of a training blade for épée. For instance, women's foil made it into the Olympics in the 1920s, and women's épée was not included until the end of the 20th century. So in brief, this is a big deal, and I am a nerd with a sword.
Yeah, so do we know how she got into épée? Like, is she going against her parents' wishes? Do they not care?
Oh, she's not going against her parents' wishes. It's her parents who get her the ex-military instructor.
Got it. Wonderful. So they're really encouraging her to do whatever she wants, regardless of whether it falls outside the norm.
I wouldn't say fully encouraging in the modern sense. It's not like the parents you'll see who are shuffling their kids always to extracurriculars and tournaments and whatnot, but it is more of a permissive household that she is living in. Anyway, back to Bryher. Somehow, despite picking up a blade, she never got into English quarterstaff, despite people around her practicing it. She did learn to ride, though, which she says was as important as learning to read and write prior to about 1910 and the beginning of people, including her family, owning a car.
Oh, yeah, that would make a difference. Sometimes I forget about the shifts in technology that were taking place.
Now, we skip forward a bit to 1909 when Bryher was 15, because that's when her parents married, though Bryher didn't find that out until she was 24.
A secret marriage?
I'm imagining there wasn't a big church wedding or anything extravagant, and therefore it wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't made a big to-do.
We're going to the courthouse today, sweetie. Have fun with your governess.
Also, at a later point, she was given the chance to have her birth be considered legitimate, but she refused this with indignation.
Really?
As she writes, she preferred the affection and the glory that came with being born out of wedlock, which again just strikes me as odd for Victorian and Edwardian times, but she was of the upper class. Money tends to lessen the blow of disapproving church ladies, even when your inheritance is smaller than it would be if you were legitimized.
Well, and it sounds like the environment that she's growing up in is less than conventional as well.
It is, but that does not mean she will be able to run her father's business, despite the fact that she is certain she could, and to be fair, considering how she dealt with money later on, biographers agree with her on that front.
Unlike a lot of our ladies.
In fact, her father also liked the idea of her running his business at some point, but there would have been logistical challenges since women were barred from the clubs where men frequently did business behind closed doors. Either way, Bryher's brother was born a few months afterwards. It was also at this time that the traveling abruptly cut off, and she was informed that she had been allowed to run wild for too long. Everything became much stricter after that.
Do we know why this happened?
So in her memoirs, Bryher doesn't give a clear-cut, oh, this happened because this XYZ. I will say it is definitely in part due to the whole getting married, but I cannot say for certain what the external factors leading to that and to this change from very bohemian to slightly more conventional. I will say that it is easier to be odd and out of social norms to an extent if you have money and are traveling fairly frequently. So it's not as if you have to sit down in church every week and hear people gossiping about you.
Right, whatever your reputation is, you don't care because you're moving on to the next place. But if you're staying in one place, I can see where that would start to rankle, hearing what people say. But this is a choice that her parents make. Is Bryher on board with this?
Bryher is not. In fact, since she is forced into boarding school, she puts it as she's forced to sink or swim alone. She further described the start of that experience thus: I kicked and sputtered in an agony of bewilderment and very nearly sank. Nobody gave me an explanation. It was a perfect preparation for Freud. The experience could have driven me to insanity or suicide, and it was as crippling for a time as a paralytic stroke. I did not recover from it until after a long psychoanalysis, and I survived only because I was tough. I am a poet, even a visionary, but I am not an intellectual type. Had I been some sensitive misfit, I should have gone crazy during the first month. To me, it is an apt description of shoving anyone into the school system who is unaccustomed to its rigid authority structure and lack of debating or control over one's own fate for a decade. To further this feeling, Bryher by this point had taken some drawing classes and was determined to be an artist, which everyone laughed at and said she was too young for. Add to this, the conditions would get the place shut down in the modern era. Windows open in winter, no heat till the temperature dropped below 60 Fahrenheit, and you were shoved outside during torrential downpours to go play or take a walk. There was a plethora of colds, and one teacher later wrote that she couldn't understand how they all didn't get pneumonia.
Wow, and this is from a wealthy family that they decided to send Bryher to this school. Did they think she hadn't suffered enough in life yet?
No, it wasn't that. It is the social and other ideas of how to raise and educate a child or a human in general that has changed a lot between then and now.
Goodness. So, Was she alone through all this? Did she have any friends?
Oh, she made some friends. They appear here and there in her memoir, but not an overall impression. I remember her saying something about how she kept in contact in the first few years after they graduated and they were off doing things, and Bryher would try and get involved in something to do outside of existing in her parents' house. But we are not there yet. So Bryher spent 2 years in this school, and while it did nothing for her intellectually, she learned a lot about how to socialize with people. It is also during these years that she took a trip to the Isles of Scilly off the southwestern coast of England. It is here that she found the island Bryher and took the name by which we call her.
Aha, so she found one good thing in that awful time.
Then she left school and, as she put it, spent the next 7 years in frustration. You remember how you thought graduating high school or college would lead you to finally getting the life you want, or to do all those things you wanted to do forever, but then life and humanity just smack you upside the head with a smelly dead catfish, leaving you confused and frustrated?
I mean, that's one way to put it.
Well, it was the exact same feeling for Bryher. She writes that due to social convention, she could not attend lectures or accept invitations to lunch, that she was scolded for writing a business letter about the fate of a manuscript to a publisher, even.
So, in other words, like, she's just checking in with them and, circling back, and they can't handle that.
It was not what a proper woman should be doing.
Right.
I would like also to add that the long list of things that would result in scolding not only includes getting wrinkles in dresses when sitting, but ends in Bryher saying, "Our generation, as always, was supposed to be unbelievably wicked."
Kids these days.
Yeah, so the next time your elderly relative is complaining about kids these days, you can quote Bryher and say the Victorians said the same thing about the Edwardians.
Things never change.
That said, she didn't get quite as much flack from her parents over these things, so due to these constraints, Bryher ended up taking Arabic lessons at the London University. However, her parents drew a line at her outright training to be an archaeologist. She did argue back about this, as it would be 3 years of school and then going with a group to Egypt. But rather than continue to wear them down, she got distracted with an invitation from a family friend to go to Lebanon. Unfortunately, war broke out before she could leave England.
Oh no, so she's trapped there.
So now we come to World War I. While there was rationing and restrictions on civilian life, Bryher did not become a nurse or an ambulance driver like many of our other women on this podcast. She did experience some of the bombing of London. She even dealt with the fear of German submarines in the English Channel, as she still went to the Scilly Islands during the war. It is also during this time that she meets the poet Hilda Doolittle, better known as H.D.
Ooh, how did they meet?
So Bryher writes that she opened the door one day to find a woman whose face resembled a Greek statue, a description that reminds me of the myth of Pygmalion. Though this version ends, or really begins, with them sitting at the kitchen table and H.D. asking if Bryher had ever seen a puffin and what it's like.
And had Bryher seen a puffin?
Bryher said there were dozens in the Scilly Isles and that Hilda must come with her next month. Either way, she basically found the woman of her dreams.
I love it. So, presumably, H.D. didn't just show up at her door. What was the, did she write some fan mail? What was going on here?
So Bryher had read at least one book of H.D.'s and sent a letter to her, and it turns out they were both vacationing or staying in the same area. So Hilda literally just walked over.
Man, now had Bryher published anything by this point? Could H.D. have read anything of hers?
Bryher isn't really known at this point. She does write a little bit of poetry. One book does get published in 1914, but Bryher as a writer doesn't hit her stride until much later, a couple decades from now, and is mainly known for her historical fiction.
Got it. So it was kind of a fan-creator dynamic at this point.
It kind of was. So a little bit of background here. H.D. is an American poet who dropped out of college and moved to England. She's been there for a bit and involved with the Imagist movement and Ezra Pound by this point in time. She's also married and pregnant in 1918, which didn't bother Bryher, who it sounds like put her on a bit of a pedestal.
So it didn't bother Bryher, and she's like, yeah, I could still date her.
Yeah, Bryher was unbothered completely by this. Oh, you are married and you have a kid on the way. Would you like a girlfriend as well?
Beautiful.
Now, things did not progress completely fine for this relationship, though you probably will not fully get a sense of that if you're just looking at Bryher's memoirs. Hilda at one point early on left to think things over, and Bryher at one point talked of suicide during the separation as the war ended. Basically, from the writer Barbara Guest's writing, it sounds like they each wanted someone to save them from their lives. And Hilda didn't know what to do when she realized that, so she took some space.
That sounds like a good move.
Then she invited Bryher to visit, but Hilda had caught the Spanish flu and Bryher had to nurse her through it.
Oh, man. So they're like, things are getting too intense. We need to separate and just like give it some time. Come back and immediately more intense than before.
While lucid at the start, Hilda insisted it was just a cold and wanted to talk about taking a trip to Greece.
Oh, that's not just a cold, my friend.
Things got worse. The doctor didn't think the baby would be born alive, and the landlady asked Bryher...
She's still pregnant?
Yes, she is still pregnant.
While she's having the Spanish flu. Wow.
It was a terrible time. And to add to the overall terror and shittiness of this situation, the landlady asked Bryher if she would pay for the funeral expenses when Hilda inevitably died.
Very sensitive.
This was the last straw, by the way, for Bryher, who essentially arranged for better treatment, moving her into a better facility and so forth. So Hilda did not die, nor did the baby, because it pays to have a rich friend possibly play arrogant asshole and arrange for better treatment.
Yeah, no, it sounds like Bryher is a good partner to have.
And before someone gets upset in the comments, I say play arrogant asshole because I have to imagine, to overwork doctors and nurses, somebody just coming in and insisting on all the better treatment and like money is no object probably comes off a bit like an asshole.
Yeah, no, and as we've seen before with the publisher, that Bryher has tried to like assert herself and make changes that she wants made, and people do not respond kindly to that from her as a woman.
Either way, things got better, but Hilda's friends didn't like Bryher.
Ooh.
In fact, they told HD it'd be better to get rid of her immediately, except Ezra Pound. He said he could manage her if left alone with her.
What does that mean?
Well, he tried that. His verdict after the painful-sounding conversation was Bryher is impossible. If you would like a brief illustration, it's the sort of conversation where there's a person you don't really want to talk to, but you just sort of nod along, going along with it, sort of wondering how quickly can I get them out of my apartment door.
I mean, didn't he end up being a Nazi? So
quick clarification on Pound and Nazis. He did get involved with anti-Semitism and Mussolini in Italy and have a radio station during World War II and then get arrested for treason.
So he wasn't a literal Nazi, but he was kind of skirting the edge there. All I'm saying is maybe he's not worth the time of day.
He did also hate Bryher after this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, Bryher's mother did not care for HD, who they initially presented to Bryher's parents as being an older chaperone so the two women could travel.
Right. Me and my chaperone want to go traveling together.
Together with HD and her daughter, Bryher did visit America and France, where they stayed for a time despite it not really suiting either of them. Bryher also, in order to avoid having to go back to her parents, got married in the US. It was quite the scandal. Her husband in this case was the American Robert McAlmon, who also then went to France. As to why McAlmon married her when he knew it was not going to be a typical marriage, he liked and respected her. He also didn't know how much money she actually had until afterwards.
That's very nice for everyone involved that he's not a gold digger.
Now, unlike Bryher, McAlmon liked France. He, with a group of friends, would actually take Bryher out, and this one outing she describes in her memoirs sounds like hell, both to read from her point of view and as someone who has never cared for clubbing. To me, it reads like a painful bar-hopping experience with people she barely knew and could only barely tolerate, aside from McAlmon.
Got it. So it sounds like their lifestyles are clashing a lot, regardless of how much he respects her.
Well, that respect doesn't last, just like Bryher's marriage to him doesn't last.
Oof.
They divorce in 1927 so she could marry H.D.'s lover, Kenneth McPherson, as H.D. was still married to another man.
So someone's got to have dibs on him.
Due to the large divorce settlement, McAlmon forever got stuck with the nickname McAlimony, which he hated.
Uh-huh.
Soon after, Bryher and H.D., plus fake husband and H.D.'s daughter, whom Bryher and her second husband adopted, moved to Switzerland permanently. Incidentally, Bryher got their mail forwarded from Paris via Sylvia Beach, whose bookshop she sometimes supported financially.
Oh, a little connection there. Do we have H.D.'s current husband going along with them, or he's just out of the picture?
H.D.'s husband and her were separated, had been for quite a while, but they do not divorce until 1938.
Dang, all right. So they are living separate lives. And in the meantime, H.D. is doing this little Switzerland polycule thing.
Now, by this point, Bryher is a writer and poet in her own right. She's published works since 1914. Some of them McAlmon published for her, though I don't believe he continued to do so after their divorce, as it sounds bitter and not conducive to making a business arrangement.
Yeah. So what types of things has she published? You've mentioned poetry, but is it imagism like H.D. is doing, or her own style?
Bryher is not fully a poet. There's only 2 books of poetry I know of that are published by her. There's some nonfiction, one of which is about Amy Lowell, an American poet of the Imagist school. So you can think of it as being a movement work colleague of H.D.'s. However, most of Bryher's more well-known work comes after World War II, when she started writing boys' adventure-inspired historical novels.
Got it.
Now, while in Switzerland, Bryher, H.D., and McPherson collaborated as the Pool Group.
So this is their hot new beach novel group? What are they doing?
So this was mainly a monthly literary journal with Bryher as assistant editor, but they also created films.
Ooh.
Most of the films exist only in fragments today, but the entirety of Borderline from 1930 still exists. You can find some clips of it for free on YouTube. You may also be able to find the entire film there, but I didn't look closely at the one upload that it might be.
Got it. Well, that's fun though, a little multimedia experience.
Aside from McPherson directing it, Bryher and H.D. do appear in the film as the woman who lets a room and as the character of Astrid, alongside only one professional actor who did the film for free, apparently because he was intrigued by the plot and how they wanted to tell the story.
So this is art film. This is not major motion picture.
Oh no, all 3 of them, they did not like what Hollywood was doing. They actually thought Greta Garbo going to Hollywood ruined her.
Uh-huh.
Now, also, after filming everything, there were various panics over where any of them had placed the footage before editing it. Like, Bryher would be writing to H.D., "Where is this?"
Oh no. I'm imagining this like comedy of errors happening.
So by the time World War II rolled around, Bryher was still in Switzerland. Prior to the outbreak of war, she had started getting involved with helping refugees. She never went to Germany for this, by the way. She took trips to other neighboring countries like Austria, where she'd work out the issues around paperwork. She said a favorite Nazi trick was to withhold the papers needed for visas.
Yeah, that is definitely a thing that I have heard of. They kind of got people trapped in the mundanities of the system, and that caused a lot of people to die.
R/boring dystopia?
Yeah, pretty much. So, what is she doing with this group?
Essentially, she worked to move refugees first into Switzerland for a few days and then on to their final destination because the Swiss would not allow their neutrality to be jeopardized by completely letting in refugees.
Right. Can't have that neutrality jeopardized. Heaven forbid.
I do want to point out that for all Switzerland did not fight in World War II, the politics of the war still bled across the border. For instance, I'm hoping in the next year to get to a Swiss writer whose mother was sympathetic to the Nazis.
Oof.
So just an FYI that things were not completely without complications in Switzerland during World War II and the time leading up to it.
I mean, also, when you look at what was happening, was neutrality the response?
Be that as it may, neither Bryher nor HD stayed in Switzerland for the whole war. They moved back to London, England instead.
Oh boy, that's a choice. Why would they do that?
Bryher had heard rumors that she was on a German blacklist for helping refugees and that she should leave Switzerland for her own safety.
Ooh.
From her writing, it also appears there were rumors of interning all the foreigners in Switzerland. Again, despite neutrality, there were legitimate worries over Nazi influence during the war.
Yeah, no, that doesn't sound great. So how is that England move then?
Bryher's main memoir actually ends there, though she does also have a separate war memoir. I will say, stuck in England during the war, it is the only time that she lived nonstop with HD. All the other times it had been come and go, rather reminiscent of Romaine Brooks and Natalie Barney, who were also forced to actually live together during World War II, if you remember either of their episodes. During this time, Bryher kept writing. She was writing the start of the historical novels that she became known for after the war.
Got it. So this is kind of a creative beginning for her in some senses.
There was also at least one mental breakdown for HD that Bryher helped weather.
Oof. Yeah, I can't imagine it's a great environment being like bombed out.
Yeah, there isn't much written around why it happened, but I think we can safely say for a woman prone to overextending herself, coupled with the stress of living in a city being routinely bombed for part of a war, it's not surprising.
Yeah.
The two continued to live together for about a year after the war ended, and then it wasn't until 1946 that they resumed more of a come-and-go lifestyle. I have seen some biographers say that their relationship ended here, while others maintain that it lasted till HD's death.
I mean, it sounds like regardless of what the dimensions of the relationship were, they were important in each other's lives.
Speaking of relationships, Bryher divorced McPherson in 1947.
How come did HD break up with him?
Basically, I don't really know.
Okay. That's fair.
It's probably written somewhere as one line in another book.
I know. That's the frustrating thing, is that it's so, like, these people are not big names, and when they are, I mean, you know, HD is pretty big, Bryher is pretty big. I don't know who McPherson is. But they're not known for their relationships. People aren't out there writing tell-all exposés.
Usually.
So, regardless of what's happening, Bryher and the husband that she was probably not into at all personally, but was doing this polycule thing with, they broke up. what's going on with this?
Well, she gives him a villa outside of Rome afterwards and remains friends with him for the rest of his life.
Okay, so they're not that far broken up.
For herself, Bryher does not immediately go back to Switzerland. She travels around the US and the Caribbean instead. At the same time, she still paid for a house in Switzerland, and the expense of it worried her because she had an easier time spending money on others than on herself.
No kidding.
A great example of this is during World War II, she actually gave HD a large lump of money that kept making interest and essentially made HD minorly independently wealthy.
Oh, imagine.
Bryher does eventually go back to living in Switzerland again between all of her trips. She also moved HD to a clinic there as they aged, and similar to 1918, was bossing medical staff around to get her the best attention up until HD's death in September 1961.
That's really sweet.
Bryher herself continued living in Switzerland and writing. She had her friends like Romaine and Sylvia until their deaths, and she had her travels. Bryher would die in January 1983 at the age of 88 and be buried in a Swiss cemetery. You know, surprisingly, going into this, I worried there wouldn't be a lot to say. Bryher comes off as a background character in this world to me, overshadowed by HD and flitting in and out of her friends' episodes. Usually that sort of life doesn't lend itself to a lot of writing on the subject, and I admit there is not a lot outside of her own writing and appearing in HD's biographies. In fact, her writing is the main backbone of this episode, so let that be a reminder. Never rely on an amorphous, foggy biographer to take an interest in you. Do it yourself.
Yeah, tell your own story.
Thanks for listening. We post new episodes every month, so subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice to learn more about the female artists, writers, and hangers-on that make up the Paris Lesbos subculture. We love hearing from you in YouTube comments, and we appreciate your tips on who to research next. And remember, don't marry a man just to seem straight. Marry a man to balance out the polycule.